You expect a soldier's grave to be tidy and accounted for, a name on a plaque, a date carved in stone, a regiment number that lines up with a ledger in some dusty archive. You expect the neat certainty of paper and parade ground, of records that march in straight columns from enlistment to burial. But sometimes the earth keeps its own ledger, a ledger that refuses to be transcribed into neat bureaucratic cells. Imagine a field where headstones whisper the wrong names, where iron buttons corrode into riddles and teeth tell stories that contradict the ink in official books. That contrast, the public certainty of records and the private stubbornness of the soil, is where this story sits, and it is there, in that unsettling border, that we will spend an hour together. I promise you revelations that will unsettle what you think you know about history and its caretakers, bones that whisper different dates, graves that don't belong to anyone in the registries, and objects that insist on being older or younger than they ought to be. I promise scenes that will make you slow your breath, fog clinging to the fields where nameplates are wrong, a churchyard at dusk with the smell of salt and the iron tang of old gunpowder, a ledger found in a county seat that simply stops, mid-name. There will be artifacts, buttons, bullets, beads, each a small, stubborn witness that argues with the official version of events. There will be competing theories, some sensible and some wild, and we will hold them all in equal measure, skepticism and wonder. By the time we step away, you may not have answers to every anomaly. Most mysteries never deliver tidy endings, but you will see what these mismatches tell us about memory, empire, and the way communities forget and remember. So come closer to the map with me, and imagine tracing your finger along the crooked lines of these places. Picture the wind pushing through winter grass, the creak of iron gates, lanterns swinging like slow hearts. Keep your curiosity. This is not a story that finishes at the foot of a grave. It bends into the questions we keep asking about who we were, who we are, and who we misname. The first place that arrested me is a cliffside military cemetery that locals call the Tumbled Headland. One-sentence teaser: at the Tumbled Headland barracks graves, dozens of soldier burials predate the regiment's recorded formation by nearly a century. The headland crowns a jagged coastline where the sea eats at chalk and flint. The cliff face is measured by cartographers at roughly 42 meters where the cemetery sits, a narrow terrace about 40 paces wide. The site is unmistakable, a stone wall half broken by wind, rows of low headstones leaning like tired chess pieces, and a peculiar strip of ironwork embedded in the ground that used to be part of an old parade square. Local lore says soldiers were buried there during a fog of confusion in 1863, cannon smoke, quick graves, names scrawled poorly and lost. The regimental books, preserved in the county armory, list the garrison established at Tumbled Headland in 1874. That gap, 11 years, looks small on a page. But when archaeologists and osteologists began to speak plainly, the gap felt like a canyon. Bones found beneath the slate markers show radiocarbon dates that consistently cluster around the mid-1770s. That's not a stray date, or an outlier. Dozens of samples from teeth and rib fragments gave calibrated probabilities that placed those lives in the decade between 1768 and 1779, with several dates peaking explicitly at 1774. Grave goods complicate the picture further. Buttons recovered from the soil bear the crown stamp used by a regiment disbanded in 1792, the button dimensions, averaging 18 millimeters in diameter, and the alloy composition, primarily a tin bronze tempered with trace elements of antimony, match nothing of the later 19th century garrison kit. Moreover, one shallow grave contained beads of a kind traded by Atlantic seafarers during the late 18th century. These beads, opaque, pressed glass, about 6 millimeters each, traced to trade networks that had largely shifted elsewhere by the 1870s. Here's where it gets tricky. The parish registry records a sudden, small spike in unknown soldier burials in 1875, and a clipped notation in a margin says, mysteriously, bones moved and reburied. Still, for all the paperwork suggesting later interments, the biological and material evidence insists these were people who lived and died before the regiment even existed. There are sensible theories. One posits that the graves were originally from an earlier coastal fortification demolished in 1790, and that in the late 19th century laborers, perhaps during an expansion of the barracks, accidentally reburied older remains within the new cemetery boundaries. Another theory suggests that storm surge and cliff erosion in the early 1800s exposed older graves, and local authorities simply moved what they found to the nearest military ground, unable to identify them properly. Now, let's be fair, record keeping in small coastal towns is notoriously patchy, and clerks in the 19th century sometimes recopied older entries into new logbooks without noting provenance. But then there are the less tidy explanations. Might there have been a clandestine burial of mercenaries or privateers whose existence the Crown later chose not to record? Could there have been a petition to cover up an embarrassing episode, a mutiny, a massacre, the burial of men from a foreign regiment whose presence was politically inconvenient? These speculations gain texture when you consider one of the local myths, that of the salt giants. Old fisherwives tell stories of finding enormous bones among the cliff shingle decades ago. Femurs too long for ordinary men, skulls broad and high, teeth like pillars. Skeptical scientists laugh at these tales and point out how erosion can distort perception. Yet in some of the larger skeletal remains measured by osteologists, the femoral length suggests an adult height of nearly 1.95 meters, tall for the period, but not monstrous. Still, the myth lodges in the imagination because the graves do not sit where the records say they should. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the sea a low drum to your right, the graves leaning like questions, the salt air lifting the smell of old iron. Imagine kneeling at a slab and brushing away lichen to reveal initials that don't appear in any ledger. Now imagine what it would mean if the official books don't hold all the stories of those who served, died, and were remembered only by the sea. But here's where it gets trickier. Isotopic analysis of the dental enamel on several skeletons suggests childhood spent far from that chalk coast, in highland regions where the diet included a heavier proportion of barley and wild greens, and where water contained a different strontium signature entirely. That evidence opens up a social map. These were likely men recruited from distant valleys, transported to the coast in the decade before 1780. That fits with known conscription practices of the late 18th century, where regiments scoured remote quarters of the kingdom for hardy recruits during conflicts overseas. Still, for all the evidence, there remain stubborn blanks. No muster rolls from that pre-1790 fort exist anywhere in nearby archives, and the only reference in a private diary from 1776 is a single line. Buried 12 at sunset, with no additional detail. We still don't know the chain that moved these bodies from the older graveyards into their present arrangement. We still don't know whether the men died en masse from disease, battle, or some quieter collapse of shelter during a winter storm. We still don't know why a county clerk's note in 1875 casually mentions bones moved and reburied, and then says nothing more. The human itch to fill such omissions with heroic story or conspiracy is strong, but when you stand on that headland and feel the wind, you understand why the land can hold its silence so long. Sometimes memory is a thing the ground refuses to give up, except in fragments that force us to rearrange our assumptions. A second mystery is inland, along a river route that once formed a bustling trade artery. One sentence teaser: the Rivergate Soldier Trench holds graves dated to 1920, but the bullets and uniform pieces belong to a 17th century Continental Mercenary Company. The Rivergate site stretches along a 2-kilometer bend of a slow-moving river that widens into marsh. The trench itself is an artificial embankment some 6 meters wide and 2 meters deep where a dozen shallow graves were discovered during the dredging of a channel in 2012. The local historical society's files list a small skirmish in 1919 involving returning veterans and passing sailors. Municipal records note 8 casualties. Yet the forensic catalog of the bones tells a different story. Ballistic analysis recovered conical musket balls, the sort used in the 1600s, with a lead composition and manufacturing seem consistent with hand-cast munitions of that earlier period. Moreover, small cloth fragments woven in a twill pattern inconsistent with early 20th century uniforming were preserved in anaerobic pockets of peat. Radiocarbon dating of linen fibers returns a calibrated date range centering on the 1630s. The graves themselves show signs of deliberate arrangement. The corpses had been placed side by side, arms crossed in a pattern that reads as ceremonial rather than hastily buried. Measurements of the graves average 1.9 meters in length, but 3 graves are longer, indicating exceptionally tall individuals. 2 of them suggest adult heights exceeding 2 meters. Theories multiply like tributaries. One historian argues the trench was used twice, originally as 17th century burial ground for a contingent of mercenaries who died of fever while quartered along the river, and then, centuries later, the trench was reused by 20th century mourners or municipal workers who interred bodies beside the already present bones without fully excavating the earlier remains. Another explanation invokes riverine shifts. The meander of the rivergate changed course over centuries, bringing older graves closer to the surface where later interments overlapped. But then the long graves and the ballistic evidence complicate the neat reuse theory. Is it possible that artifacts from the 17th century burials were deliberately kept or hidden and later reburied with more recent bodies in an act of remembrance or ritual? Could local families have known about the older graves and, in a symbolic act, chosen to bury loved ones next to anonymous ancient soldiers, creating a line of continuity that bridges centuries? These hypotheses are reasonable, but they don't fully explain the precision of the older projectile manufacture or the ceremonial alignment of the older interments. Myth threads through the Rivergate story too. Fishermen's tales speak of the long men who walked the marshes long before roads, men taller than oxen who carried broad swords and spoke a language like the river. Small children are told to avoid the thick fog over the bend. That is where the long men come to sleep. Anthropologists who visited the area recorded how the oldest residents would sometimes point out a flat, reed-choked mound and say, with a kind of resigned affection, "That's where the helpers lie," implying a communal past of hired foreign soldiers or mercenary bands that once worked the landscape. Now, let's be fair, the mercenary companies of the 17th century did travel widely, and trafficking in foreign soldiers was a resilient industry across Europe. Linen fragments and musket balls could have been traded as curios long before the modern era. Yet the physical alignment of the graves and the clear preservation of hand-cast ballistics are stubborn facts. Picture yourself wading the reed beds at dusk, the mosquitoes a soft, maddening cloud, the river thick with tannin and reflected stars. Imagine kneeling, uncovering a curved strip of leather once part of a powder horn, and feeling the cold outline of history under your fingers. Still, for all the evidence, we still don't know if these men were local conscripts pressed into foreign service, lost mercenaries who never made it home, or victims of a forgotten clash whose register simply did not survive the fires and floods of time. Another site is an old colonial cemetery tucked behind a ruined farmhouse, set within a square of waist-high stones. One-sentence teaser. In the Ashwell Yard graves, soldiers tagged with colonial unit insignia lie in graves dated a century before the insignia was created. Ashwell Yard sits in a valley cleared for sheep in the late 18th century. The farmhouse was a small logistic hub on a route that linked coastal supply lines to inland holdings. The stones encircling the yard are crudely worked, each about 60 centimeters high, arranged in a rectangle roughly 12 by 18 meters. The yard contains approximately 17 graves, some paired, some alone. The curious detail: the iron insignia recovered from the graves, a small, stamped plate with a motif of crossed rifles beneath a star, matches the emblem of a colonial regiment formed in 1848. Yet the botanical samples from pollen trapped within the graves show an assemblage of plants that were common to the region before 1780. Including wild thyme and a species of clover that was replaced by pasture grasses in the 1790s after enclosure acts. Radiocarbon dates on coffin nails and wooden shroud pegs center on the 1770s and 1780s. What interrupts a neat reading is that the iron insignia has clear indices of later fabrication, machine-pressed edges, a small stamped serial number that follows a sequence only introduced in 1850. How did an emblem manufactured after 1848 find its way into a grave whose organic remains predated by decades? One way to reconcile this is to consider post-burial disturbance. Perhaps in the 19th century, when the farmhouse was owned by a family with a son in the colonial regiment, they relocated an old grave marker to Ashwell Yard as a gesture of memory, inserting a contemporary insignia with the bones as part of a ritual of claiming ancestry. Another, Darker possibility suggests the graves were reused as a convenient place to inter fallen colonial soldiers. While doing so, the local family may have placed a regimental plate in the older soil to lend dignity to the new funerals. Yet the presence of the insignia in direct contact with older bone matrix in at least 3 graves points to deliberate insertion at a time when decomposition had already advanced, a detail that would suggest reverent reburial rather than casual placement. Mythic talk among elder villagers adds color. Some insist these were time-crossed graves, places where the past and future brushed, and that every few decades the yard hummed with an odd, low noise like distant marching. Now, let's be fair, such stories often grow to explain anomalies. A small, rational explanation, a 19th century family reusing a pre-existing grave and leaving a modern emblem, fits when measured against social practice. Still, for all the plausible accounts, we still don't fully know the sequence of events that placed a mid-19th century insignia among 18th century interments, nor do we know for whom the family meant to claim lineage when they modified the yard. Then there is the desert site, far from any neat maps of empire, a ring of soldier stones known locally as the Sunless Circle. One-sentence teaser: the Sunless Circle contains graves from a campaign recorded in dispatches of 1911, but osteological evidence shows the skeletons predate mechanized warfare by centuries. The Sunless Circle is situated on a plateau of packed red loam, windswept and broken by shallow gullies, a place where the horizon flattens into heat shimmer. The circle measures some 20 meters across, each stone an oblong slab standing about 1.5 meters tall, set at even intervals like the teeth of a slow clock. In the center, the soil has been disturbed across a shallow area measuring approximately 8 by 10 meters, within which 4 graves were excavated. Contemporary diaries from 1911 note that a punitive detachment passed through the plateau and made camp near the standing stones, and list 12 men killed in an ambush. Local oral histories confirm a skirmish, but the bones in the center graves show trauma inconsistent with early 20th century firearms. Cut marks on bones suggest edged weapons, non-ballistic trauma, and healed lesions indicating long-term survival after previous wounds. Radiocarbon dates on collagen cluster around the 14th and 15th centuries. Yet, in a small leather pouch found among the remains was a ticket used by the 1911 detachment, an identification tag stamped with the unit's number and the year. How a 20th century tag rests amid bones several centuries older is the kind of twist that makes archivists tap their fingers. One line of explanation argues that the 1911 unit camped at an ancient burial site and inadvertently mixed their personal effects with the older soil. A plausible scenario when you consider the practice of using ancient rings of stone as landmarks in open terrain. Soldiers might have lost or intentionally left behind tokens, which then became entrapped in soil pockets during later depositional events. Alternatively, the tag could have been placed deliberately as an offering, a practice observed in many cultures. Later groups sometimes leave their marks among older burials in attempts to claim continuity or to ask protection. There is also the unsettling possibility that a later reburial occurred. Perhaps local people, fearing desecration, reinterred more recent dead within older graves to disguise them. Myth attaches itself to the Sunless Circle with particular ferocity. Travelers tell of a low hum at dusk and an impossible coolness that gathers in the center, even in the height of day. Nomads say their ancestors tied recent deaths to the circle to keep spirits from wandering. Now, let's be fair, ritual offerings placed in older graves are widespread across cultures, and a soldier's tag could be such an offering. Still, for all the sensible possibilities, we still don't have a full chain of custody explaining how a 1911 identification tag came to rest among bones whose organic signatures speak of medieval lives. Across these examples there is a pattern, not of deception, but of layered human action. Graves are reused, relics are recycled, and landscapes are palimpsests where different eras write over each other with varying degrees of care. In each case, physical science, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, ballistic typology, offers a set of hard data that often contradicts documentary records. That contradiction is not an indictment of archives so much as a reminder of human fallibility and the uneven survival of records. People forget, records burn, clerks err, And sometimes those oversights were deliberate, names redacted for political reasons, burials moved to conceal scandal, graves reused in times of scarcity. But beneath the bureaucratic errors there is something deeper. These mismatches frequently reveal social margins, the lives of hired hands, of mercenaries, of the soldiers conscripted from distant highlands whose names never made it into polite histories. They point us toward what the archive often leaves out, the messy, everyday reality of recruitment, transport, disease, and the often anonymous exit many soldiers took from the world. Still, for all the evidence and the sensible reconstructions, the mind clings to myth. Giants in cliff shingle, long men in marsh reed, time-crossed insignia in pastoral stone, these stories are not just errors of imagination. They are human responses to gaps that feel too large for ordinary explanation. Picture yourself across all these sites, not as a detachment of experts but as a neighbor who remembers an old story told by a grandfather, who keeps an emblem in a wooden box because it feels right. Imagine running your palm over a rusted button and thinking for a moment that you have touched the hand of history. That emotional contact is powerful. It is also why, when new data arrives, a calibrated date that pushes a life a century earlier, a chemical signature that proves a childhood across a sea, the community sometimes resists. The new facts rearrange beloved narratives, and people sense their own memory being edited. We still don't know how many more of these mismatches wait beneath our feet. We still don't know the full stories of the men whose bones complicate our tidy logs. We still don't know what it would mean for our shared history if the registers we trust were far less complete than we imagine. Picture yourself walking these sites at sunset, holding a small lamp that throws an amber glow over slate and lichen. Picture the wind carrying the smell of old gun oil, of peat, of time. Imagine kneeling and feeling the ground's reluctance beneath your fingertips. What do you think you would find? What would you want to find? These questions are not only archaeological, they are moral. They ask us how we record the lives of those who serve in the shadow of empires, and how we reckon with the anonymous dead who keep insisting their stories be told. You lift your hand from the cold earth and the story keeps unfolding, as if every site were a loose page in a volume that refuses to stay bound. Picture, then, a field known locally as the Hollow Barracks, an empty ridge above a railway where the grass grows in neat tufts, and the land dips into a shallow hollow that the elderly still call the parade ground. At first glance it looks exactly like the kind of place where a regiment would drill and then fade into memory, but the hollow hides a stubborn mismatch. The graves here were marked in municipal maps as interments from a winter campaign in 1943, yet the metalwork and personal effects preserved in anaerobic pockets suggest a supply and uniform system that ended with the Napoleonic Wars. Imagine walking there on a gray morning, the rail line whispering, the hollow like a mouth between teeth, and finding a brass button whose design was discontinued in 1812. That single brass disc, stamped with a crown cipher and edged with ropework, does not belong to 20th century constabulary kits. The field yielded fragments of wool so tightly woven that they match 18th century tailoring techniques. The sewing thread itself, made from spun flax with a plant resin sizing, reads as if it came from a tailor's shop fueled by hand power, not factory machines. Still, municipal burial orders and a ledger entry tucked in the rail company archive list a group burial after a skirmish in early 1943 involving a blown bridge and a small detachment of soldiers who never made it back to a station roll call. How to reconcile a ledger that names a date and an event with cloth and metal that belonged to a century earlier? But here's where it gets tricky. When the graves were sampled, the osteologists found a pattern of healed fractures inconsistent with modern ballistics, curving peri wounds and shallow slashes that suggest close quarters, edge combat rather than the blast trauma typical of mid-20th century firefights. That suggests either the graves contain older bodies disturbed and intermingled with newer interments, or that modern soldiers were deliberately dressed in older garb before burial as a kind of ritual or disguise. Both possibilities are plausible in a landscape where supply lines broke down and improvisation was common. Still, for all the evidence, the hollow keeps its silence about motive. Were these men reclothed by locals who thought burial with older regalia conferred honor? Were there political reasons to mask their identities by burying them as if they belonged to another era? We still don't know. There is a different kind of mismatch at Ironwood Ridge, a place where iron stumps line the slope like the ribs of some buried machine. The ridge commands a narrow pass and has been strategically important for centuries. Carved into its eastern face is a shallow recess where, according to an 1831 surveyor's note, a band of foreign soldiers was laid to rest after a plague. One sentence will get you into the heart of the mystery. At Ironwood Ridge, colonial coins minted in the late 19th century were found tightly bound in a small leather pouch inside an otherwise 17th century burial. The coins are polished and modern by the standards of 19th century production, uniform, with milled edges and a small mint mark that did not appear until 1871. But the wooden splints used as crude coffins, the hand-forged iron nails with square drives, and the pollen trapped in the fabric reveal an environment consistent with the 1600s. Now, let's be fair, people carry curios and heirlooms across generations. The presence of later coins among earlier burials could have been a later addition, a token left by descendants or scavengers. Yet the pouch holding the coins was found within the articulated rib cage of one skeleton, snug as if placed there at the time of burial. That changes the reading. If the pouch was indeed placed with the corpse at the time of interment, then either the coins are older than their assumed minting, which challenges mint history, or the dating of the bones and wrappings is wrong, which would be an embarrassment for the labs involved. The scientific tests held, wood samples, collagen, microfossil analysis, all point to a 17th century death. So we face a social puzzle instead of a lab error. Who would have a pouch of coins minted 2 centuries later at the time of a 17th century burial? Folklore offers one possible window. Among shepherds who still graze flocks on the ridgeline, there is a tale of a keeper, a stranger who appeared in a storm and promised to feed a village famine in exchange for a single night's shelter. He left at dawn with a pouch of glittering metal, then vanished. Years later, the villagers claimed that the ridge had been blessed for a time, and that those who were buried there wore a charm to guard against bad winters. Could a later charm have been misdated because it was left within the grave during a commemorative act? Another possibility is more political. In the late 19th century, local elites sometimes staged archaic burials to create a sense of noble antiquity for estates, a performance of lineage and legitimacy that used older burials as stagecraft. We cannot rule out performative burial. We can only say this: people have long used graves to construct narratives, and the material record sometimes becomes an active participant in those narratives, not merely a passive witness. Picture yourself standing at Ironwood Ridge on a blue sky morning, the wind carrying the dry tang of iron and wool, and imagine bending to pick up a scuffed coin from the turf. You can feel how easily a small, shiny object can anchor a story. We still don't know whether the pouch was intentional at the time of burial, a later offering, or evidence of a social ritual that tied different eras together in a single act. Far to the north, where the land hardens into rock and winter seems to live by its own calendar, there is the site locals call the Frozen Watch, a grim set of graves on a slope that faces a narrow inlet. The watch was noted in a naval dispatch from 1898 as the place where a small landing party disappeared in a whiteout. The official file lists 6 men lost to exposure. Yet isotopic readings from the bone phosphate of those claimed sailors tell a more complicated story. The strontium and oxygen ratios indicate childhoods spent in 2 distant regions, some in coastal fishing towns and others in inland mountainous valleys far from the sea. Among the skeletal remains were fragments of clothing made from a tightly woven cloth of a type that had not been industrially produced until the mid-20th century, and one blade fragment, corroded to the color of old tea, shows a manufacturing temper and alloy associated with a steel forge known to operate in the 1600s. How can blade centuries old and cloth technology yet to come appear together in graves whose recorded cause of death is exposure in 1898? One way to understand this is to consider migration and scavenging. Northern communities often repurpose older iron and clothing technologies circulate in curious ways through trade and salvage. But the presence of a hand-tooled blade whose metallurgy matches a known early modern smithing signature complicates salvage narratives. Could that blade have been an heirloom, a talisman passed down through generations and finally interred with a man who perished in 1898? Could the cloth have been acquired later, perhaps as part of an experimental textile introduced in the 1930s and traded back into the community some decades later, only to find its way into a grave associated with an earlier event? Now, let's be fair. Such mixes are entirely plausible in a world where material culture does not age in a straight line. But these unlikely juxtapositions still prick at intuition. They make us ask whether our categories of time, this is 1898, this is 1600, sometimes fall apart when people, objects, and memory swirl together. Imagine standing at the frozen watch, a gust of wind prying at your collar, the inlet jabbing the horizon like a cold finger, and thinking that time has been folded there. We still don't know whether the blade was an heirloom or evidence of some older conflict that the 1898 file absorbed into its neat ledger. Now imagine a valley where the soil is black and sweet and the air tastes faintly of smoke. Here is a site the townsfolk call the Ember Hollow, where a line of graves curves like a comma beside a long-abandoned kiln. One sentence holds the oddity. Ember Hollow's graves are catalogued as civilian burials from a small fire in 1882, but chemical traces in the bone collagen speak of chronic exposure to metalworking fumes common 2 centuries earlier. The kiln itself dates variously in different surveys. Pottery shards anchored to a small hand-thrown tradition point to the early 1700s, yet a charred beam beneath the burial layer returned a date firmly in the 1790s. The grave goods are an odd assortment: small iron rings, a handful of pewter buttons, and the fragment of a musket-lock plate hammered flat but inscribed with a regiment number that, on paper, belongs to a unit raised in 1870. Local oral history tells of a conflagration one night when sparks leapt from the kiln and took a cottage, killing 3 people. The municipal record is crisp: a coroner's note, a list of names, a date. Yet the bones tell a story of repeated occupational exposure, bony changes in the inner ear, lesions linked to long-term inhalation of certain metallic oxides, markers of a life spent in a craftsman's forge rather than the sudden death of a household fire. That mismatch encourages us to ask whether those buried were long-term kiln workers, invisibilized in their own death notices, or whether older individuals who had worked in metal were later conflated with a separate, more recent tragedy. But here's where it gets tricky. The flattened musket plate seems to have been deliberately inscribed at some point after its flattening. The number looks like a later addition, hammered into a surface already stressed by corrosion. Was it retrofit to make the plate tell a new story? Did a grieving descendant, in an attempt to honor or perhaps to mask, add a new clue that misleads modern eyes? Picture yourself at Ember Hollow when the sky is low and a distant train moans. Imagine lifting a fragment of pewter and seeing the thumbprint of a long-dead artisan. We still don't know whether these graves actually belonged to the victims of the 1882 fire, were older workmen honored later, or whether a community used an older burial ground to cloak a new sorrow. Across all these places, a pattern emerges, not a tidy conspiracy, but a human habit of layering narrative upon narrative. People reuse space because land is finite. They reuse objects because metal is valuable. They reuse rituals because the rhythms of grief repeat across generations. That layering turns the landscape into a mosaic where each tile is a temporal fragment, often mismatched with its neighbor. When we encounter a coin in a 17th century chest, a modern insignia in an 18th century yard, or an industrial textile in a medieval burial, the initial itches to suspect fraud or error. But often the more revealing story is social. Who valued what, when, and why? Why would a family in the 19th century add a modern plate to an older grave? Why would a unit in 1911 leave a tag among medieval remains? Why would a brigand choose to shelter a body in a place where a stranger had been buried 300 years earlier? These are not purely technical questions. They are questions about memory, identity, and the human need to stitch continuity across the discontinuities of loss. I want you to imagine yourself at the edge of a field at dusk, holding a small trowel and a light. The light throws shadows that look like old maps. You uncover a sliver of bone and with it a small item, a button, a coin, a bead. For a moment, this small object is a key. It opens a door in your mind to a life that is otherwise anonymous. You picture a young man running a finger over a brass token, perhaps folding it into a pocket for luck, never imagining centuries later someone will use it to argue about dates and manufacture. You imagine a family, generations later, pressing a regimental plate into the soil above an ancestor's bones because the family line needs to be seen to be honorable. You imagine the ritual logic, protection, honor, claim, that makes certain objects travel with the dead across decades. These are not simply archaeological anomalies. They are small acts of human agency that complicate the tidy timelines historians prefer. But of course, myth is never far behind. In the market towns near many of these sites, stories circulate that sound eerily similar, about guardian spirits who rearrange the graves so that the dead may rest beside friends rather than foes, about hilltop stones that refuse to reveal their inscriptions until a particular lineage returns, about night watchers who see the past reenact itself in ghostly parades. Now, let's be fair, such tales often arise to explain what the documentary record cannot, and they hold social truth, even if not literal truth. They tell us about the way communities process grief and maintain a sense of continuity when the ledger fails them. Still, for all the airy romance of ghosts and guardians, the physical mismatches remain stubbornly empirical. Radiocarbon dates, isotopic signatures, metallurgical analyses that resist reinterpretation. Those sciences give us anchors, but even anchors can be moved. We still don't know precisely how many of the mismatched items result from deliberate acts of memory-making, from practical reuse of materials, from clerical error, or from the messy overlay of centuries of human movement across the same ground. So we keep digging, not because we are certain we will finally harmonize ledger with bone, but because each scratched-away layer shows us new things about who we were, who we remember, and how memory itself can be an instrument of power. Each mismatch is a story about the edges, the people pressed into service, moved across seas, buried in haste, and then remembered or forgotten depending on who controlled the ink. Picture again the headland, the trench, the yard, the circle, the hollow, the ridge, the watch, the hollow kiln. Picture the slow work of archaeologists and historians and neighbors who sift through the soil and the records, and imagine how patient, stubborn, and sometimes tender that work must be. Imagine tracing a name that appears for a single breath in a county ledger, and then watching that name evaporate from other records. Imagine the frustration and compassion that lead a community to keep a name alive by placing a modern plate on an ancient stone. We still don't have the final paragraph for many of these lives. We still don't have a comprehensive mapping that reconciles every artifact with a date, every bone with a ledger entry. We still don't know whether, if we could speak with those buried under lichen and moss, they would choose to tell us about the names written beside them or about the hands that carried them to the ground. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. A new layer waits beneath the turf at a place mariners call the Fogward Slip. One-sentence teaser. At Fogward Slip, dozens of supposed sailorman graves dated to the 1820s contain trade beads and carved bone that point to an even older, pre-contact network of seafarers. The slip is a cove no wider than 300 meters across where the cliffs curve inward like an embracing arm. A sheltered pebble beach runs about 60 meters from the low cliff base to where the tide cuts shallow channels. Local charts note a small quay built in 1818 to service coastal packets. The parish register lists 9 burials from a storm in 1823 when a gale took a fishing fleet. But when maritime archaeologists weighted the anaerobic sediments of the slip during a low tide survey, they found more than storm victims. Buried in compact, shallow graves, each just under 2 meters in length, were beads of a pressed corroded glass type known to circulate with Polynesian and Micronesian voyagers centuries before European contact. There were also delicately carved bone pendants whose stylistic vocabulary matched motifs from islands known to have exchanged with early Austronesian mariners. Radiocarbon dates on associated shell and charred kelp place these particular burials not in the 1820s but clustered around the late 1400s to early 1500s. The physical layout of the graves is telling. Aligned toward the point of the cove rather than the parish church, each grave headless and without the iron crosses common to 19th century burials, suggesting a funerary logic that oriented seaward rather than inward. But here's where it gets tricky. A ledger fragment found in the Quartermaster's office describes a cleanup after the 1823 storm and a list of bodies committed for reburial. In the sailor's plot, the words could imply reinterment in an existing burial ground, one that perhaps older mariners already used. Then there are the oral memories, recorded by a local ethnographer, of an old song fishermen occasionally sang when the fog came, a refrain about long ships and long wives, lines strikingly resonant with Austronesian seafaring myths about return and loss. Now, let's be fair. Trade beads and carved bone could have arrived by later collectors or through drift, items that washed into the cove and were buried with newer bodies. Ocean currents can move small objects across vast distances given time and chance. Still, for all the evidence, the patterns of burial orientation, the specific bead typologies, and the radiocarbon clustering argue for a much older maritime presence, one that complicates national narratives about who first charted these coasts. Some historians propose an accidental convergence of material culture, that European sailors collected exotic items in later centuries and buried them with 19th-century dead as curios or talismans, thereby creating a palimpsest that confuses stratigraphy. Others suggest that pre-modern mariners from across the seas reached these shores earlier than assumed, leaving material traces in remote coves that later storms would bury deeper. There is also a more sensational local myth, that Fogward Slip is where the long-legged sailors came ashore, people of the ocean who walked like wading birds and left markers in bone. For the people who live with the cove's memory, the slip is a scene where world histories touch and fray. Picture yourself kneeling among wet cobbles, the smell of brine and algae, lifting a bead that has been cold in the earth for half a millennium, and feeling, for a heartbeat, the vastness of maritime time. We still don't know whether those beads arrived with the storm of 1823, were offerings left by relatives from afar, or are the last whisper of a forgotten seafaring contact that history has largely overlooked. Further inland, along a dry ridge dotted with juniper and the pale bones of sheep, lies a small ossuary the villagers call the Salt Road Ossuary. One-sentence teaser. On the Salt Road, a communal ossuary catalogues soldiers inscribed in municipal war lists, yet osteological markers and pollen spectra suggest that many interred there lived decades earlier and belonged to an order that predated the town itself. The ossuary is a stone shelter built into a sunken lane about 8 meters wide. Within, dozens of skulls are stacked on mortar shelves, each with a carved number corresponding to a civic register established in 1902. The register lists names, regiment numbers, and causes of death, most mundane, some tragic. When bioarchaeologists sampled enamel and bone from several skulls, the isotopic signatures painted a mosaic of diets and geographies not typical of the town's recorded recruits. Several skulls show isotope ratios consistent with childhoods in arid inland plateaus hundreds of kilometers away. Others carry the chemical echoes of coastal diets, rich in shellfish. More surprising, a cluster of skulls exhibited dental modifications, small drilled perforations along the molar crowns, that match ritual practices documented in an inland culture that flourished between 1650 and 1720 CE. These cranial traits do not align with the standardized health and dental profiles of 20th century soldiers who served in the town's militia. Here, the municipal drive to catalog the procession of dead into neat lists collides with a heterogeneous past lived and embodied in bone. Still, for all the evidence, the context of the ossuary must be weighed carefully. Communal reburials are common in regions where space or sanitation make in-ground burials impractical. The ossuary could have been a practical municipal solution that collected older bones from scattered graves into one place and labeled them during the 20th century registry push. Another possibility is that a late 19th century campaign of nationalism sought to create continuity by collecting and renumbering remains into state-sanctioned sequences, effectively folding disparate pasts into a single civic narrative. The more speculative theory hints at forced removals, bones moved by authorities during periods of land consolidation or urban renewal, then recatalogued under modern bureaucratic practices, thus erasing original funerary contexts and replacing them with state-friendly records. Myth adds texture. Elders say the ossuary was a meeting place of roads, where travelers once laid offerings so their journeys would be guided by the dead. Others whisper of a time when bandits left the skulls as warnings at crossroads. Picture yourself in the dim coolness of the ossuary, lantern light catching on bone and mortar, numbers penciled beside names that do not always match the teeth beneath. You imagine the fragility and stubbornness of memory contained there, how a ledger can declare a life but the body can tell a different geography of origin. We still don't know whether the ossuary's labeled sequence truly represents who those people were, whether the bones were collected in good faith, or whether the register is a later imposition that simplifies a complicated human past. Let us step back and widen our view for a long moment, because these mismatches are not isolated curiosities. They are a set of recurrent motifs that teach us how histories are made and unmade. Across bog and cliff, ridge and quay, the same pattern returns. An archive claims certainty while the bones, beads, and brass insist on complexity. Sometimes the problem is archival accident, fire, flood, wartime looting, that dissolves names into shadows. Sometimes the problem is human design, reburial for honor, concealment for shame, or the practical reuse of land. But there is also a deeper mechanism at play, the politics of memory. Who has the authority to name the dead? Which deaths are recorded on stone and which are folded into anonymous piles? When a county clerk crosses a line in a ledger, when a family fastens a modern plate to an old stone, when soldiers leave a tag among medieval bones as a gesture or an affront, those acts are part of a larger conversation about belonging and absence. Now, let's be fair, the sciences we use, radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, metallography, are not oracles that speak with one voice. They have error terms, calibration curves, and interpretative margins. A sample dated to the late 1500s has a probability distribution, not a single absolute. Isotopic maps are improving but remain coarse-grained in many regions. And human behavior is messy. People carried heirlooms, converted older objects into new uses, and sometimes buried the dead with objects that had wholly different stories. So when we place a would-be paradox in front of us, coins in a 17th century grave, modern insignia among 18th century bones, the immediate temptation is to fear that science will overturn the narrative we want to hold. But usually the truth is more human. It tells us about movement, devotion, thrift, ritual, and the pressures of survival that make people reuse and reframe. Consider the soldier who folds a mother's bone pendant into his pocket for luck, the farmer who hides a modern plate in a cleared old turf to keep his family's claim alive, or the community that buries new dead beside revered elders to claim continuity. These acts explain many mismatches without invoking conspiracy, though conspiracies exist too, and we must leave them on the table. Here is a reflective insight: these mismatches are invitations. They invite us to practice humility about what we know and to cultivate an ethic of care about what we find. When a scientist brings a precise date and an archivist brings a neat line entry, the two do not cancel each other out. They enter a conversation. That conversation is richer when rooted in respect for the communities for whom the graves are not data points but kinship anchors. Imagine, then, approaching each site not as a scene for triumphant correction but as a shared project. Picture archaeologists, historians, and local people sitting in a long, low room, the air smelling of tea and coal, passing around photographs and ledger fragments, translating old dialects together, arguing over where to place a new plaque. That collaborative practice changes the stakes. It shifts our questions from, "Who is right?" to, "What does this tell us about belonging, loss, and the stories we keep?" But we must also acknowledge the ethical contours. Exhuming a grave to test a bone can feel like a violation to descendants who see the dead as resting. The authority to probe should be earned by open dialogue, not assumed because a sample is scientifically valuable. Where possible, non-invasive tools, ground-penetrating radar, remote sensing, archival cross-checking should be the first step. When invasive work is needed, it should be done transparently, and with a plan for reburial or memorial that respects local customs. The stubborn mismatches we find are not puzzles to be solved for academic glory alone. They are responsibilities. Each corrected date, each reattributed insignia, and each new hypothesis shifts a social memory and, with it, the honors or obscurities assigned to particular lives. As you think about all these places, the headland, the slip, the trench, the yard, the circle, the hollow, the ridge, the watch, the kiln, the ossuary, consider what it would mean if the ledger were a living text rather than a fixed object. What if we treated registers as drafts, to be amended as new evidence arrives, and to be annotated with humility when they cannot be reconciled? Such an approach would keep the moral center intact. The dead deserve careful handling, the living deserve truthful accounting, and history should be a conversation rather than a verdict. Picture yourself one last time, leaning on an old stone at dusk, the air cool and full of insect song, and realize that beneath your palm the earth remembers in layers. The mismatches do not diminish the dead, they deepen their presence, remind us that lives cross maps in ways official documents rarely capture. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. You step into the shadow beneath an old cathedral and find that stone keeps its own calendar. Picture a crypt beneath the vaulted choir of St. Maur, its air thick with incense dust and the remembered scrape of bell ropes, where the carved effigies of knights once served as doctrinal anchors for parish memory. One breath in that place, and you expect names chiseled in Latin, dates that march in neat Roman numerals, and the slow dignity of clerical record-keeping. Instead, you find dog tags stamped with a 20th century unit number tucked into the breastplate of a carved knight whose heraldry marks him, by style and pigment residue, as a 14th century retainer. The stone effigies are about 2 meters from head to toe and lie as if sleeping. Their armor is a faithful sculptural record of chain and plate made by hands trained in medieval craft. Yet beneath the foot of one effigy, in a thin cavity the size of a bird's nest, an enamel disc with a modern serial was lodged, corroded to black but still legible to a patient eye. The parish rolls list deaths of 3 local notables in 1327 and then a clean page for several centuries. The cathedral's own inventory, maintained with obsessive care, has no entry for 20th century reburials beneath the choir stalls. How did a contemporary identification tag come to rest in a place meant to sanctify a much older memory? It is tempting, at first, to imagine a neat clerical blunder. A 20th century curate, in a rush to secure relics during wartime, moved a tag for safekeeping and later forgot to note it, or a zealous preservationist in the 1920s grafted modern materials into the crypt as part of a restoration campaign. Those ideas are plausible. But then you must live with the physical evidence. Scrape away a little mortar and the stratigraphy shows a deliberate pocket cut into the stone. Not a random debris deposit, but a small, intentional space carefully formed to receive an object. The tag was not simply abandoned, it was placed. The tag stamping shows the serial format that became common during mobilizations in the 1940s, and an associated textile fiber found in the cavity returns a calibrated date that centers on 1941. Yet the cavity sits within a wider fill of mortar and earlier organic detritus whose dates cluster around the late medieval period. Here's where it gets tricky. The juxtaposition could be an act of devotional syncretism. In times of national crisis, communities sometimes fold the present into the sacred past, using ancient stones as sanctuaries for the new dead. Perhaps a parish, desperate to honor men swept away in an air raid or a coastal landing, hid their names among the saints so they might rest under the watch of tradition. It is a touching theory and one that sits well with the way people use sacred spaces to anchor loss. Still, for all the kindness of that hypothesis, we cannot ignore a darker angle: concealment. Heritage sites have been used to hide identities, to protect the remains of combatants whose allegiance embarrassed local authorities, or to disguise the origins of individuals whose presence was politically inconvenient. Picture yourself kneeling by the effigy, lantern in hand, the stone cool beneath your fingers, and imagine the hush as you lift a corroded tag and trace its numbers. You feel the intimate shock of anachronism. It is the kind of moment that makes you question whether every tidy archive has a secret seam sewn into it. Now consider a cut in the earth by an old railway line where ballast and sleep intersect with human stories. The Red Bridge cut is a shallow gash through chalk and clay where workmen in the 1840s blasted a route for the new iron road. Alongside the line, a small cemetery grew for men lost to accident and disease. Official company minutes list 7 deaths in a slide in February 1843, names entered with a kind of corporate compassion. Yet when an engineer investigating subsidence in 2016 opened a shallow grave to install a modern drain, he found not only remains but a neatly folded military banner under the collarbone, its weave consistent with early 19th century manufacture, but the dye patterns echoing a regiment that, in military lists, did not exist until 1855. Banner and bones formed a puzzle. Textile analysts examined the weave and the mordant residue and concluded that the cloth was indeed produced on hand looms common in the 1820s, but the insignia sewn onto it used a printed block technique not commercially used until after 1850. How did a banner whose components point to different technological eras end up with bodies that, osteologically, appear to belong to laborers and not regular soldiers? There are practical explanations. Banners get recycled. A laboring group might repurpose an older textile, and a later emblem sewn on could mark a new affiliation or an attempt to create an honorific connection after a disaster. Work crews often form temporary militias during times of unrest and might have adopted an emblem as a morale object, sewing it onto a banner made from older cloth. Another theory contemplates theft and trafficking. Banners lost in the chaos of mid-century revolts could have been traded, patched, and finally used in groundworks, only to be buried with men who died in an unrelated industrial accident. Yet there is a thread of local myth that keeps the story electric. Railwaymen whisper of men who march under two flags. A rumor about a band of foreign volunteers who work tunnel jobs in secret, their allegiance shifting with paymasters, their final wish to be buried under the banner they favored that week. The truth is likely less romantic, but the image lingers. A banner that is both older and newer than the body beneath it, a symbol stitched through time, telling us that materials travel in uncanny ways across generational hands. Picture yourself on the ballast, the clack of distant freight like a metronome, and pick up a frayed tassel. In that touch you feel not just the fiber but the knot of history, people stitching identity from the scraps of what they had. Then there is a low-lying marsh called Redfern where the earth is soft and the sky wide, the kind of place that retains the stench of past blood like dark tea. The Fen was the site of a series of guerrilla skirmishes in 1671, recorded in a provincial pamphlet that became, over the next century, a staple of local legend. The pamphlet names 32 militiamen and boasts of a heroic last stand. Yet when a preservationist excavated a marked mass grave in the Fen during a flood control project, she unearthed skeletons whose stature exceeded expectations. Femoral measurements suggested men of impressive height for their period, many exceeding 1.95 meters. And with those long bones came a scatter of ironwork too heavy, too robust, to belong to common militia, broad swords with ricasso scars, buckles engraved with foreign script, and a ring of teeth, actual human teeth, threaded on sinew, deposited like a necklace around one skull. Radiocarbon dates clustered not around the 17th century but the earlier 16th. The pamphlets' names, transcribed carefully in the county library, belonged to small landholding yeomanry, yet the bodies in the Fen speak of a different caste, men who could have been mercenaries, veterans of continental wars, or even members of a lost clan of tall-bodied people whose presence in the marsh had been remembered only as others in the oral tradition. This site compels us to balance oral tradition with physical science. One theory argues for a conflation over time. Later chroniclers might have assigned a local narrative to older remains discovered during the clearing of the Fen, thereby turning unknown foreign fighters into hometown heroes whose names fit the needs of civic identity. Another possibility suggests a violent reburial. Destitute families, fearful of vengeful neighbors, might have interred foreign dead in communal wet ground to erase them from the register. The ring of teeth is especially haunting. Some anthropologists point to ritual uses. Necklaces made from teeth as trophies or talismans are documented in many warrior cultures. Could the tooth necklace be evidence of a band of fighters who carried the teeth of enemies as a ward against bad omens? Or is it the result of later scavengers who created a grotesque assemblage of bones and threw them into the Fen? Myth adds a final color. Older storytellers insist that the Fen was a place of giants, and that the ring belonged to the captain who drank rivers. You can laugh or you can listen. Either way, the material record doesn't lie easily to you. Picture standing on a raised causeway as rain begins, the fan breathing out mist, and imagine holding that heavy sword guard and feeling the unnatural weight of a life that crossed borders. A different resonance appears where a garrison once kept watch over a salt pan and left its name to a shallow pool. The garrison of Redwater was small and strategically modest. Records show it supplied escorts for convoys in 1802 and logged losses due to fever. Yet when conservation workers drained a bog near the garrison lands, they found a cluster of burials that included a uniform buckle fashioned in a style officially retired in the 1760s, and incongruously, a silvered medallion bearing an imperial motto from a dynasty that did not control the region until decades later. The medallion's inscription, in an elegantly hammered hand, reads like a late ode to imperial favor. How did an object tied to a later political era appear in the grave of a man whose osteological markers show a skeletal maturity consistent with the late 18th century? Did the medallion travel backward in the pockets of an heirloom? Was it pilfered and then buried? Or is there a record-keeping error so fundamental that it warped generations of archival work? As you consider these anomalies, ask yourself how easily we trust linear time. People are not clocks. They carry histories in their pockets, in the seams of their clothes, in their scars. An heirloom medallion given to a son might be melted and reminted, carried across wars, and finally interred in a grave that bureaucrats date to a conflict decades earlier. An object can be a talisman, a barter item, a sign of allegiance, or a later addition designed to recast memory in a more flattering light. Communities have long retouched their past to serve present needs. Placing a medallion in an older coffin can be an act of honor or of appropriation. Picture yourself bending into the bog, the air humming with insects, and picking up that delicately engraved medallion. In your palm it is cool and plausible and stubborn. It tells you that people do not leave the dead alone. They insert them into stories. We still do not have every answer. We still do not know, in many cases, whether anachronistic objects were placed out of reverence, necessity, theft, concealment, or simple carelessness. What these sites teach us is that the dead are never quite gone. They are threaded into the living's attempts to remember and to belong. The mismatch between record and body is not a failure of history alone. It is evidence of human life's improvisations. There is a moral complexity here. When a community repurposes a grave or an object, it may be trying to preserve dignity against the erasures of time. When a state reorganizes bones into an ossuary or assigns them catalog numbers, it is asserting a narrative of belonging that can both include and exclude. The job of those who study these things, archaeologists, historians, ethicists, is not simply to correct the ledger but to interpret the reasons behind each intervention. That work must respect the living and the dead alike. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. When you pull back from the maps and the test tubes and the ledger pages, when you stop tallying dates and chasing serial numbers, what remains is not a tidy contradiction, but a human story braided through time. These mismatches, coins in 17th century graves, 20th century tags tucked into medieval effigies, beads from distant seas and coves thought to be charted only recently, are less puzzles to be solved than doors to be opened. They invite us into the interior life of communities and the interior lives of those communities dead, people who were loved, feared, quarreled over, remembered imperfectly, and sometimes deliberately reimagined. The pattern that emerges from the headlands, slips, trenches, yards, circles, ridges, and crypts is not a conspiracy of error but an archive of human improvisation. People rework their pasts with what they have at hand: metal, cloth, ritual, official ink, because memory itself is a practical art as well as a moral one. Think about why a family might press a modern regimental plate into older soil, or why a community would hide the remains of the recent dead beneath an ancient stone. In one sense, these are acts of devotion. A family wants its fallen recognized. A parish wants to fold the present's grief under the shelter of a sacred past. In another sense, they are acts of strategy. During times of political danger, concealing the origins of a body, or of a token, can be an act of protection. Sometimes the action is purely pragmatic. Land is limited, stones are reused, and the neighbor who has a plate is the neighbor who gets to decide where a burial marker will go. The archaeological surprises force us to attend to these thin human logics, the ones not always visible in neat recountings of wars and muster rolls. A ledger's authority rests on permanence, a bone's authority rests on biology, an heirloom's authority rests on the affection that carried it across generations. When those authorities disagree, the disagreement teaches us more than concord ever could. Listen to the voices that layer the sites. The clerk who wrote, "Bones moved and reburied" in the margin of a county volume was not a villain or a simpleton. She was a person tasked with making an unwieldy world legible for officials who demanded order. The fisherman who hums an old refrain about long ships is not a mythmaker in the pejorative sense. He is a living conduit for memories that do not cleanly fit into the ledger. The scientist who meticulously calibrates dates is not the opposite of the storyteller. She is someone who makes visible the deep temporal currents beneath our feet. The work we ask of history is plural: to catalogue, to contextualize, to feel. Scholars bring tools and rigor, but the truest interpretation is collaborative and humble. A community's recollection is not a rival to science, it is a different kind of evidence, one rooted in social practice and continuity. The reconciliation of these forms of knowing should be an act of mutual respect, not a battle to crown the truest account. The emotional payoff of these mismatches arrives slowly but powerfully when you imagine the cumulative effect on identity. A town that discovers beads from a distant sea in its fishermen's graves realizes that its history is not an isolated story but part of a far wider human network. A parish that finds modern dog tags beneath a medieval effigy discovers how grief can leap centuries to find shelter in sacred places. An ossuary that bears the fingerprints of distant childhood diets reveals that even a locality's roster of soldiers is a tapestry sewn from many geographies. All of this reframes civic pride and private memory alike. The past, we see, is not a closed book, it is an attic where belongings have been reorganized, where souvenirs of one voyage have become relics for another, where names have been shifted to protect families or to promote narratives. That revelation is disorienting at first, but it is also liberating. To be human is to inherit complexity, and to accept complexity is to accept the full, often messy truth of who we are. There is, too, a moral lesson about power. Records are never neutral. Registers and ledgers reflect administrative choices: what to record, how to phrase it, whom to notice. Governments and officials have long used archives to consolidate claims of property, of lineage, of rightful narrative. When bones and beads contradict those claims, they remind us that official story-making can misrepresent or omit entire cohorts. Mercenaries, conscripts from distant valleys, the poor who die anonymously on a cold morning. The mismatches force us to ask who gets counted and who gets forgotten, and to consider the ethical duty to reconfigure memory in more inclusive ways. When science shows that a supposed local hero was in fact a migrant soldier from far away, the community must decide how to reweave that person into local identity. It is not simply an academic exercise, it is an act of public conscience. The visceral images that linger from these inquiries deserve attention. Picture a woman in a coastal cottage settling a dog tag under a saint's effigy, hoping it will shield her son. Picture a laborer around a kiln flattening a musket plate to carry as a charm. Picture a child on a pebble beach finding a bead and feeling the weight of a world older than her grandfather's maps. These are intimate moments of meaning-making. They are, in a sense, acts of storytelling by which ordinary people anchor their lives to something larger than the day. It is tempting to discipline those stories into neat academic categories. But if we do so too zealously, we risk stripping them of the very warmth and contradiction that make them meaningful. A good historian or archaeologist learns the art of holding paradox, to accept that a single object may be devotional and utilitarian, recent and ancient, mundane and sacred. Practical ethics should guide our next steps. Exhumation and analysis must be accompanied by consultation and consent whenever possible. Non-invasive methods should be prioritized when they can answer meaningful questions. When invasive methods are essential, plans for respectful reburial and commemoration should be part of the project's design from the outset. Communities, scholars, and institutions should co-author narratives that reflect both the scientific data and the social memories, making space for uncertainty where it persists. Memorialization should be generous, recognizing both named and unnamed lives, and flexible, allowing updated insights to be integrated without erasing the emotional investments communities have already made. We must also guard against the lure of spectacle. These mysteries can be sensationalized: giant skeletons, secret tribunals, conspiracies of erased armies. Sensationalism amplifies curiosity but often flattens nuance and diverts resources into showmanship. A more constructive curiosity is that which accompanies listening and care. The public deserves the romance of mystery, but not at the cost of ethical rigor. Good stories, those that stand the test of time, balance awe with care, and wonder with responsibility. Finally, consider the meaning of the last line as both conclusion and beginning. Each mismatched coin, each anomalous bead, each out-of-time tag is a summons to look more carefully, to ask better questions, and to include more voices. The riches of the past are not only in monumental architecture or famed battles but in the small, stubborn artifacts that refuse to conform. They ask for interpretation, yes, but they also ask for respect. The dead are stakeholders in our histories. We owe them not merely attention but dignity in how we treat their remains and their stories. A ledger entry corrected by a scientist is not simply a right answer on a page. It is a reorientation of community memory that can heal or harm depending on how the knowledge is handled. Think of the sites we have walked together: headlands that keep fog-shrouded bones, slips where beads whisper of long voyages, trenches where bullets tell two stories, yards with time-crossed insignia, circles that tie medieval bones to modern tokens, hollows where cloth and brass argue about eras, ridges with pouches of impossible coins, crypts with 20th century tags under medieval stone. Each is a locus of human action, of forgetting, remembering, concealing, honoring. Taken together, they teach a lesson about history itself. It is not a linear sequence but a palimpsest, a layered surface where each generation writes, erases, and writes again. That palimpsest is not an injury to truth. It is a record of life's complexity, a testament to how human beings make sense of death and continuity under pressures both practical and existential. So what do we do with this knowledge? We listen. We consult. We correct gently and publicly, allowing communities to integrate new facts without feeling humiliated by them. We fund the patient work of archaeologists, historians, and archival scholars who approach these questions with humility. We teach a public that history is provisional and deliciously complicated, so that when the next unexpected bead turns up in a coastal grave, the response is not ridicule but curiosity coupled with empathy. And perhaps most importantly, we honor the dead by remembering that the authority to name them is not a privilege owned by a single ledger. Memory is communal and distributed. It is prosaic and sacred. It is written on paper and in bone. Keep digging. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.